Hi, it's Robin, RsIslandCrafts, and welcome back to my craft room. Today is part 2 on how I've decided I want to face my little art quilts. If you remember, a facing is just binding pulled all the way to the back where you don't see it on the front. You still end up having to hand stitch it to the back. If you were to stitch this down, you would definitely see. Now this one isn't too bad, you might be able to stitch in a ditch here, but generally if you were to stitch it down, you would definitely see a line of stitching on the front. So for those who don't really care for hand stitching it down, this might not be the project for you. Now in the previous video on Friday, I showed you how I did it on a square quilt, and today we're going to do it with one that has a little bit of a fun edge to it. I'm using the same green. And all I did is I took right sides together. This is the right side. As you can see, the way it's modeled and stuff, it kind of looks faded like it could be the back, but this is the front of the fabric. And I'm going to put the front of my little art quilt down. I think this is a great way to take, if you didn't want to make a whole quilt of block in the months or of a favorite quilt block that you like, you can just make little ones and for holidays and stuff and just hang them up around the house or in your craft room. So I just made sure I had a little bit around, all the way around the edges. You don't need to have too much, maybe a ½ inch or an inch. And where it was wavy up here, I just left it straight. Now what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to stitch around the entire little art quilt. I'm not going to leave any openings for turning or anything like that. I know, it's scary, but we're going to do it a little bit differently, and I'll show you how we're going to turn it later. But this is going to be really good for quilts that aren't perfectly square or rectangle. All the sides aren't a straight line. Sometimes you might want to have some circles coming off the side, or you might have some weird angles that would make it really hard to put the regular facing on or a normal binding. Now you can go ahead and you can pin all the way around your quilt so that none of your fabric shifts. As you see, I just whipped the pins in there all willy-nilly, no really having them specifically close or anything. I like to pin from the inside to the out so it'll be easy just to pull it out as I'm stitching around. This would be a good spot to also use a walking foot and to keep everything from shifting. I'm going to go ahead and head over to my sewing machine. I'm going to stitch all the way around with about a ½ inch seam, and then I'll come back and I'll show it to you. I've gone ahead and stitched all the way around. As you can see, I did not leave any openings. I'm going to go ahead and trim this green facing fabric away. It kind of almost feels like backing right now, which is very similar. And I'm just going to trim it right along the edge. You can use the rotary cutter on the sides like this, or you can just use your scissors. You can save these pieces and use it for a future art project or an art quilt. Fill a doggy bed up, pillowcase for make a dog bed. Some people throw them out for the birds and other people just throw them away. Now as you can see, let's look from this side. When I stitched this, I just stayed still within my ½ inch or so, and I just followed along the edge of the little wall hanging. If as you're trimming around you've noticed some of your seam allowance might be a little larger in some places than others, you can go ahead and trim that down a little bit. Okay, everything's all nice and trimmed and even. Now are you ready for the scary part? To be able to turn this into facing, I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut out the center. Yes, I know, it's a little scary, but just go nice and slow and easy and you'll be okay. The things you want to be careful of is when you make your first cut, you want to make sure you separate your front from the back so you're only cutting into your facing. The second thing is when we flip this around to the back, we need to have enough that comes around to the back and that we can turn under at least 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch so we can hand stitch it all the way to the back. So you don't want to trim really close. You want to kind of just stay and take out the center. Now you can follow along the design you already have. You can create a new design, so where these 3 sides are nice and straight, I could kind of cut them a little wonky so that it looks like it's more of an art quilt on the back also. You can really have a reversible quilt depending on what you use for the backing. Now I know it sounds wasteful for fabric, and trust me, you know, if you've been hanging out with me in my craft room for a while, I'm a little bit cheap when it comes to fabric. I like to use up every little bit. I am saving these pieces for a future project. I make crumb blocks, all of that. But we're going to cut out a large enough piece in here that we can use this fabric for another thing. We can be using it for applique. We can use it to make crumb blocks. So this pieces that we're cutting out won't be a waste. It would probably be really scary if, like I said, you were putting it on a king size quilt, or if you had a large wall hanging that maybe was 2 or 3 feet long by a couple feet wide. But we're not throwing away the fabric, so it's okay. So we gotta be brave. Separate our 2 pieces and make a snip. You can always start out a little wider, flip it around and see what it looks like, and then if you don't like it, you can always trim it down a little bit. So let's see. I'll just kind of stick a little straight through here. Now remember, it's just fabric. If we have to, we could always take, it is using your seam ripper, but you could always take your seam ripper and remove, if you made it too narrow, remove it and put a new one on. Or you could also put a second one. Let's say we made this too narrow. We could put a whole nother one. Let's say we put a red piece on here, right? And make sure we cut it wider than our oops. And then you can have a 2-layered facing. So you'd have another element on the back of your quilt. There's ways around everything. We don't always have to throw things away, start all over from scratch. Now in here, I think I'm going to try to mimic it, but I'm not going to be worried too much because as it is already, I'm going to have a corner in this section. So I'll just gently kind of go like this. And then straight down. And there we go. Still scary looking, but now we got cuteness peeking through, and it's okay. Once again, we have our corners to deal with, and I think for this one, I'm just going to snip off the corners. Now we have some curves here, so we could always put a few little snips just to ease it around a little bit easier. If you don't do it and you try to flip it and you get all a bunch of ridges and wrinkles and bubbles, then you can go back and do it. If you want to try it without it, then go for it. It's only a little bit of a 1/4 inch or so seam allowance, so for something like this, it's probably not going to make that much of a difference. These curves are pretty relaxed. And then just flip it again. I'm going to poke my corners. I like to run this along the seam here. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and take it over to the iron and I'm going to give it a good press. And there it is. The facing is all the way to the back. I've gave it a good press. I think for me the hardest part is at this point is making sure that you have everything to the back, giving it a good press, and I always struggle with corners. But once again, now we have to do the hand stitching to the back. I kind of like the way the green frames this fabric. You can use your binding clips to make sure everything stays to the back. With something this wide, you might also use some pins instead. Let's get in a little close and see where we're at here. Now the straight edge should probably be the easiest part to go ahead and do the hand stitching. You just choose how far you want to fold it back. You can fold it all the way back so that this piece of fabric comes back into this little channel groove valley here. You can tuck it in underneath here. And then stitch around, and that will give you a nice double thickness. And when you come to the curvy sections, you can still do the same thing. The binder clips would definitely hold everything in place for you if you went all the way up to the edge. You're going to have your curvies here are going to be kind of on a little bit of a bias. I don't know if it's a true bias, but you're going to have a little bit of a stretch factor to help move things around. And with your corners, sometimes you might have to just cut a little bit in if you have a very wide corner here. You might have to ease this in, or you can also, if you were to go, just give it a little snip. It helps ease all that in. Or you can just go ahead and give it a nice curve. I don't know if I've curved enough, but that'll help it just fold under. Now when you come into a curve in a corner like this, you're probably not going to be able to get that to go all the way in. So you'll have to taper it to the edges here. But it's a work in progress. As you're doing it, you'll be able to see which ones you need to move and how you need to move them in. But I can feel the tension here and how it's not going to let me. But once I go ahead and I give it just a little bit of a curve, now, as you can see, it's really not that much of a curve. It makes it easier to go ahead and bring that under. And then if you wanted to, as you've got everything around this way, you can go ahead and hit it with the iron to hold it all in place. If you want to put some pins along here, use your little clips. Whichever works for you. You just want to make sure that your green's not going to show onto the front, and then just go ahead and do your little hand stitch. Now if the hand stitching is the part that you have a problem and you want your back of your quilt to look really nice and you don't want to see any weird stitches, go ahead and make your stitches visible on purpose. You can go ahead and do something similar to a buttonhole stitch so that it shows all the way through here, because sometimes people have a hard time having their stitches hidden and invisible along this edge. So if it bothers you if one or two stitches stick out, try to match your thread as best as you can and take it nice and slow and go around it. Otherwise, use a contrasting thread and make sure your stitches are visible on purpose. Make sure that they're just a little bit larger. Maybe make a large one and then a small one. It's your quilt. Make it any way you want. If you're going to hang it up on the wall, it's going to be on the back and nobody's going to see it. I like how just a little bit of a curve here adds a little dimension to it. Now, of course, this will make it a little bit more difficult to hang it. You could still put the little casing in the back to hang it on a rod and just hang it down a little bit further from the top, so a little bit extra would be sticking off of the top of your little casing in the back. If you use the command strips, you're just going to stick it on there anyway, so that doesn't matter. I think the only time it'll be hard is for me when I put the little alligator clips on it to hold it and hang it from my curtain rod. it doesn't give me, I have lower parts and higher parts, so that might be a little more difficult. I might have to add some tabs to the back of this. I could also add little tabs to the underneath side where you don't see it sticking up, and just hang it from that, and then it'll be hidden, and this part will hang above the curtain rod. So that's how I've decided for the moment to be facing my quilts. I showed you 2 different ways. I showed you how to do it with a square and a rectangle, and I showed you how to do it with some fun little edges to it. I hope you try this technique out. I really like the way it works for an art quilt. I like how everything just kind of is nice and clean. It's more like a painting versus an actual quilt. I hope you get to do something crafty this week, and I'll see you later. Bye!